Sorry, dude, you got.
Well, good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Dorothy Barnett, Executive Director of the Climate and Energy Project, and your moderator for tonight's Community Wind Workshop. Tonight, we are kicking off our summer-long workshop series with support from the Kansas Department of Commerce. Josh, Svaty, and I will provide an overview of wind energy in Kansas. Currently, over 40% of our power is generated from wind energy. We'll talk about how we got here, where we go from here, what the development process looks like, and what role can everyday Kansans play. I know that conversations about wind energy development can be an emotional topic, and that tonight we may have those who both support wind energy as well as those who may be ardently opposed. At CEP, we use a set of simple rules to guideline our interactions in this virtual space and beyond, and we're asking for your help with them tonight. The most effective use of our time is to ask questions in the chat rather than to add commentary. So I'd like to just share those rules with you, starting with the platinum rule: to treat others the way you want to be treated, to notice the room and build awareness together, to be curious, open, and respectful, to call in to people and not out, to throw sunshine, not shade, to be conscious of your intent versus impact. Your intentions may be good, but the impact on another may be hurtful, and you are responsible for the impact of your words. We will have CEP staff monitoring the room so that we can have a safe and respectful dialogue tonight. So let me introduce you to the Climate and Energy Project. When Kansans have questions about renewable energy, they turn to the Climate and Energy Project, sometimes called CEP. For 14 years, CEP has been a trusted leader focusing on renewable energy as a productive, long-term solution with economic, environmental, and climate benefits. Our mission is to build resilience in Kansas through equitable, clean energy solutions and climate action. Our programs address clean energy, climate resilience, climate and energy policy, and civic participation. Using a collaborative approach, CEP connects people, organizations, and ideas, presents science-based facts, facilitates critical thinking and community engagement, and co-creates equitable and productive solutions. Our work drives climate adaptation and reduces risk while increasing community resilience in Kansas. Our work throughout the state has connected us to the business community, chambers of commerce, economic development professionals, education, faith, environmental, and agriculture organizations. We have been a resource for planning commissions, county commissions, and policymakers at the local and state level who are navigating the transition to clean energy. Could I go to the next slide, please? I'd like to begin tonight's presentation by sharing a little bit about Kansas and our place in the wind industry. At the end of 2020, Kansas ranked #2 in wind as a percentage of our total generation, #3 in corporate and wind purchases, #4 in wind power installed capacity, and #4 in wind power generation. We were also #5 in the number of wind turbines installations, with a total of investment of over $11.4 billion. Wind energy in Kansas powers the equivalent of more than 1.97 million homes. a lot has changed over the last almost 2 decades with wind energy. You can see in 2019, Kansas generated 41.45% of its electricity from wind power versus where we were in 2010. There are numerous environmental benefits from generating from wind power. It creates no emissions and uses virtually no water. The equivalent number of water bottles saved with our wind energy is 35 billion. And over the past decade, we've avoided more than 8 million metric tons of CO2. Next slide, please. As you can see, wind farms and businesses serving the wind industry are all across the state. At the end of 2020, we had over 7,300 megawatts of wind energy. When fully developed, operating wind farms and those under development will represent over 8,000 megawatts of wind energy, varying in size from a 4 megawatt project at Fort Hays State University to the 470 megawatt Flat Ridge 2 project that spans 4 counties. This is a slide created by the Kansas Department of Commerce, and it's interesting to see how many Kansas counties are currently hosting wind farms. Over the life of these wind projects, these counties will receive over $657 million in donation agreements and property tax payments. They have benefited from more than 8,000 construction jobs, 563 permanent jobs, and nearly 13,000 indirect and induced jobs. So tonight, we're going to hear from Josh Svaty. Josh has over 15 years of experience with the Kansas wind industry. He's been a lawmaker, the Kansas Secretary of Agriculture, and he is a landowner and farmer in Ellsworth County. He has real lived experience to share in his personal and his professional life, and we're very happy to have him join us this evening. Josh, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you, Dorothy, and thank you everyone that's here this evening. Appreciate you giving up your evening. It's a kind of a nice Tuesday night, and I know that we all have things that we may otherwise be wanting to do or needing to do, but this is a big issue for the state of Kansas. I appreciate you giving up some of your time to do it. It's also always fun to be on a webinar with Dorothy. She and I have worked together now for a long time. My wife, Kimberly, and I split our time between Topeka and Ellsworth. And so we are familiar with a lot of these battles in a political sense, but just as some background for me, I was in the legislature for 7 years, represented what was at the time the 108th legislative district in the Kansas House, which was all of Ellsworth County, rural Saline County, a little part of Dickinson County. And about 2 years into my tenure as a legislator, Ellsworth started to have some community meetings because there were some individuals that were coming into the county and trying to lease for a wind farm. And there were some landowners that had already leased and were very excited about it. And then there were also some landowners that did not want the wind farm. And so we had some contentious public meetings in the county. We also then, as a legislator, there was a push to bring some legislation forward to control the siting of the wind turbines at the state level to prevent them from being built in Ellsworth County, because Ellsworth County was unzoned. So they didn't really have to get a zoning permit to build them there. And all of this happened in the run up to the construction of Smoky Hills Phase 1 and Phase 2, which are, if you're driving to Colorado on I-70 and you get past Salina, those big wind turbines up on those hills, that's the furthest east are Smoky Hills Phase 1. And then the second is Smoky Hills Phase 2. There's actually 3 wind farms there. There's also a wind farm called Post Rock owned by a different developer. So that long stretch of wind turbines are 3 different projects, but I was in the legislature when those were developed. And it's kind of funny as we As we continue to see wind farms built across the state of Kansas, every community maybe feels like, well, this is the first time we've ever gone through this, and we don't know how to handle some of these questions. And I can tell you, as someone that's been through it, maybe a few of the details change, but for the most part, many of us have been through this process before, and on multiple different levels. And so I'm here to answer questions and happy to share some of my experiences. But that was my beginning of the understanding of wind energy in the state of Kansas. And out of some of the fights that happened in Ellsworth County over the Smoky Hills Phase 1 and Phase 2 came much of the siting that we use now statewide as the industry uses and develops moving forward. And so I've basically seen it all. I've heard it all. Like Dorothy, we've been to the 8-hour public hearings. And so want to share a little bit about what we know about developing in counties, so that if you're sitting in a county and you want a wind farm and you're like, why is it that I can't get this? Hopefully I can answer that this evening. Or perhaps you're watching and you're like, well, I don't want a wind farm. You can learn about some of the reasons why they may or may not choose your local area to develop. So next slide. So first of all, and back to what makes a project go in a county, you have to have a good resource. This is no different than the old oil days where they were going to come and try to lease where they knew there was going to be oil. So do you have a good wind resource? Do you have a good solar resource? And then second, is there support for it to be developed in the area? Third, does it meet all of the guidelines and clearances that the industry may have to go through in order to build it? And is there something in your particular area that will prevent them from being able to build it at some point in time? And then does the developer know what the county needs in order to make the project happen in terms of working with the county? And then, of course, what's the long-term relationship going to look like? And since it's cited at the local level, it's generally a question of what's that long-term relationship going to look like with local government. Next question, or next slide. So I use this slide as an example. When the developers first came to Ellsworth County, this was 2003, 2004, they were still at the time literally looking for cedar trees like those you see in those photos that were consistently pushed in one direction by high winds. And you'll see these, as you go over what is called Lincoln Hill, that great big hill, kind of where the wind farm starts in Ellsworth County. Well, it's right inside Lincoln County. You'll see these evergreens at the tops of those hills just being pushed by a south wind all the time. So that's that question of, is the resource good? And that's how in the early days they would go looking for project sites. That's not the case anymore. They put up sophisticated anemometers that measure those wind speeds. They know exactly what the resource is going to be like. But another important thing to remember, wind turbines have become so much more efficient that in the early days, and again, this is like oil and gas. In the early days, they wanted the best possible winds they could go get. And Kansas has some of the world's finest resource for wind. It's not just about how hard it blows, it's about the consistency of the wind and does it blow at the times when you need it the most. And Kansas has just exceptional wind. They, in the early days, they were simply looking for, is this a windy spot? Anyway, back to the wind turbines being more efficient. Now, just about everywhere in Kansas qualifies as a quality wind resource. Certainly when you compare it with other states around the country, our resource, north to south, east to west, is just superior. Next slide. But the big one that I want to talk about a bit this evening, what is required to build a wind farm in your area? First of all, are there local landowners that are interested in leasing for the project? And a lot of times you'll go to a county meeting and there may be people that may not support wind, and they said, well, we didn't like how a developer came in here and they didn't even start talking to the county. They just started talking to a few landowners to get this project started. Well, first of all, they're not required to talk to the county when they begin leasing. And secondly, what they're doing is taking the temperature of that area. They have maybe looked at the resource there. They feel like it's a good spot. Maybe they've had an anemometer in place for several years. But before they're really going to start developing, they want to make sure they have enough landowners that are interested in leasing for the project, because wind energy projects, wind farms, cannot use eminent domain to build their project. Eminent domain is when you have the right to condemn a piece of property, and it's usually used in pipelines and transmission lines, big public projects that may require condemnation to get the entire project built. Well, Kansas law clearly says wind farms cannot use eminent domain. So if you want to build a wind farm, you have to find willing landowners that are willing to lease their property. And you want to get a sense of whether or not that's going to be the case before you really start to sink a lot of money and time and energy into a particular project. The other thing that you need is there sufficient load demand in the area to just use that project and the power it produces, which is probably unlikely, or the more likely scenario is there transmission capacity in that area that can ship that power to another place. And so they're going to check the transmission capacity. And then do they have permission to access that transmission if it is there? And do they have transmission for the size of the project? So when they started developing the project in Ellsworth County, it was at the time a very large project. It was 250 megawatts. And so they had to get permission from the Southwest Power Pool. They had to have a study done on the transmission in that area to make sure that it would have the capacity to have that power leave that area. And that was all before they ever had a power purchase agreement in place. Next slide. So kind of what I was saying earlier, I want to always just reiterate this. If a wind farm developer is in your area working, it's probably early on setting up anemometers and all of the meteorological data that they need to compile to make sure that the wind speeds are quality in that area. They simply cannot look at the trees and stand out there and have landowners say, you know what, it's really windy here. They have to test it and have data over a number of years to find out. And at that point, if they decide to move forward, they can begin to lease. The other thing that they have to have is actual control of the land or the size of the project. So they have to have that land leased. And then finally, they have to have an actual position in the queue, which is the Southwest Power Pool's generator transmission interconnect request list. So they can't simply say there's a lot of capacity on this transmission line. They have to have a place in the line. The study has to be completed. The Southwest Power Pool can take multiple years. And all of that has to be in place for them to actually develop a wind farm. So if you're in a county and you can't figure out why they haven't built one yet, I would consider several of these elements. Do they have enough data? Although by now we're generally sure of a lot of the wind quality in the state of Kansas. But do they have control of enough land to build a wind farm? And then do they have a position in the queue of the Southwest Power Pool for that request for the interconnect? And is that, has that been studied, and do they know that there's actually enough load to be able to handle a new project in that site? So there's a lot of things that have to happen in order for a wind farm to get built. Next slide. And then after all of that, those are just the sort of business economic decisions. The developer also has to make sure that it passes muster with the Endangered Species Act. It has to have NEPA review. They look at archaeological and historically sensitive sites, both from federal registers and then also from locals. They have to get FAA flight clearances, and then the state guidelines that have been in place for over a decade. So, and a lot of these came out of the projects that were built in Ellsworth County. Those guidelines are to avoid intact prairie, to work with the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks to develop potential issues early in the process. And then you can either mitigate if you end up with problems, or you can move some turbines, or you can do a little bit of both. And this is actually a great opportunity to say, like, So Dorothy and I are tonight, but there are a series of these throughout the rest of the summer. And one of those, I think it's July 13th, but I may be wrong, will be with a spokesperson for the Department of Wildlife and Parks, walking you through just exactly what they look at when they have a discussion about helping site wind farms. And it's really, really interesting information. So next slide. One of the big things that came out of our early discussions was that Kansas, being the home of one of the last great expanses of tall grass prairie in the world, 96% of the remaining tall grass prairie, which used to stretch all the way from Indiana and Illinois down into northern Oklahoma, I think only 4% still exists of what was originally there, and 96% of the 4% is in Kansas. And so it was determined by Governor Sebelius that that was important. She was able to bring industry in. They talked about it. I was still in the legislature when we had these discussions, and they decided, okay, we can protect a region in the state of Kansas and simply decide not to develop there. And we can do it voluntarily without statute. So they developed what you see in the blue lines, which was called the heart of the Flint Hills. To be protected, no wind development in that area. So you have the intact prairie plus the intact sky view or view shed, so you can't see wind turbines in the distance. Then in the Brownback administration, they expanded that to within the red lines. So you see everything there within the red lines, everything from the Oklahoma border all the way up to the final tier of counties on the northern side of the state of Kansas. And then Governor Kelly has also reaffirmed the Flint Hills box that we now have. So it's been bipartisan and supported, and the industry supports it too. And they simply don't build in that area. Next slide. So then the other thing they look at, and we had this discussion in Ellsworth County when they were coming in and deciding to build, do you have to issue a permit? If you're in a zoned county, you don't have to issue a permit or a conditional use permit or a special use permit. If you are in a zoned county, they probably have to go through your planning and zoning committee and maybe have some rules established in terms of blade heights, blade clearances from the ground, turbine heights. But the other thing, the one thing that you'll have to have a discussion about in either a zoned or unzoned county is, do they have a road maintenance agreement in place? When you construct a wind farm, some very large pieces of equipment and construction pieces have to be brought in, and these are usually in pretty remote dirt road environments. So there's going to have to be some upgrades made to the roads, and the industry, the developer always pays for that. So actually the county ends up getting nice roads in place. Has the county negotiated a pilot? Now every project that's built in the state goes on to the property tax rolls after 10 years. But when we were building Ellsworth back in 07, Smoky Hill phase 1 and 2, they were still life of the project property tax exempt, but they still paid a pilot, which is a payment in lieu of taxes, to the county. So that needs to be negotiated with the county commissioners. And then, do you have any special agreements with individual townships? There are some townships that have needs that are different than others. So you have to have those discussions too. Next slide. This is a slide. Again, Dorothy did a great job talking about the amount of money that goes into some of the counties. We can skip through this one. Next slide. The long-term relationship, again, a lot of people are always like, what's it like 20, 30 or 40 years from now? First of all, you've got the pilot payments. Secondly, you have repowering, which is when maybe there is technology in the nacelle, which is the very top of the wind tower, that has improved a lot in 10 years, and they want to change that out. So they may come in and repower the project. So they'll switch out the nacelle on top and put a new one in place. The towers themselves can last 80 or 90 years. I mean, they are really built very, very well. But the nacelles and the blades, they may want to improve over the course of the life of the project. And then finally, decommissioning. And tower removal, as I said here, is usually spelled out in the individual leases. The money is set aside in escrow. That lease agreement will follow whomever it is that owns the wind farm. If it's a different owner of that wind farm at the end of the power purchase agreement or at the end of the life of the wind farm, the requirement to decommission will still be in that lease, and that money that's been set aside will be there. And on top of that, you're talking about largely steel and copper, two items that are incredibly valuable, and no entity is simply going to leave them standing in a field somewhere. So decommissioning is a part of every project. Next slide. This is another one just for you, in the future, if you want to go back to those slides, just sort of explaining some of what's been done at the state level in terms of the property tax agreements, and then some of what's been done with the decommissioning. Next slide. So then the big thing that everybody's always wondering is what is coming next. I don't think any of us in 2005 thought that wind would grow as fast as it did in Kansas. And so I think all of us are kind of excited because we're really at solar where we were with wind in 2005. It's coming very, very fast. Price of solar is coming down. And then corporate purchasers, large purchasers of electricity want solar, because the one thing that solar does incredibly well is that it produces the most power in the hottest hours of the afternoon. And that's when electricity is most valuable, because typically the demand on electricity is highest in your hottest days in August when everybody has their air conditionings on. So solar is perfect for that. And it fits well into a diversified power mix. Next slide. And then storage also is coming, which is a huge new element that they may go back and retrofit onto some existing wind farms, just because storage is so handy for a power source that can be intermittent. Next slide. This shows you, like, if you're wondering and you're in a county, what is the cheapest power around, this shows you how dominant wind has become through the Midwest here. There are a few counties where it is not the cheapest form of electric generation in the state of Kansas. If you know anything about power in Kansas, those Northeast counties are, because it's right around Jeffrey Energy Center, which is a large baseload coal producing unit in the Evergy system. And then down in Southeast Kansas, which is probably a carryover of some hydro or some natural gas or older coal units coming out of Oklahoma. Which is why those counties are tucked in there. But otherwise, wind is the cheapest form of power across the bulk of the state of Kansas. And people may say, well, if wind is so cheap, then why are my rates going up? Well, I cannot explain everything to you, but I do know that because there are transmission charges, there are environmental upgrades or environmental retrofit charges that have to be taken care of. I do know this, though, when utilities go out to buy power, wind is the cheapest form of power on the market right now. And it is competitive with natural gas, even if you remove the production tax credit, which here in Kansas, we have no control over that. That's a federal initiative. Next slide. So just to tell you how much wind we now have in the state of Kansas, the SPP, the Southwest Power Pool, which governs this area, we set a new record on May 8th with an 84% wind penetration for the entire Southwest Power Pool, which runs from northern Louisiana all the way to North Dakota. 84% of the power on the system at that point was from wind. 87.5 was from renewables. And I think, had you asked Dorothy, had you asked myself, had you asked anybody in 2005 that it would be 84%, we would have told you it simply wasn't possible. It's amazing what has changed in the industry since we started building 15, 16 years ago. Next slide. These are just kind of who's buying the wind. So if you build a project, it's not like beef or wheat. If you produce more than you need, you just stick the wheat in a grain silo until somebody needs it, and then you go and sell it. You can't do that with wind. You have to have a buyer for the energy that you're producing. And so usually, or initially, it was local electric purchasers. So electric cooperatives, municipal utilities, and investor-owned utilities. Next slide. But what has happened is corporate purchasers are now able to buy these projects. They're able to take advantage of the tax credits from them, take advantage of the long-term price lock that they get in a power purchase agreement. So very cheap, affordable power. And it makes business sense for them to do this. They figured this out, and they love to purchase wind, and they love, frankly, to purchase Kansas wind because it's arguably the best in the country, or the second best in the country. Next slide. So you can see then the growth of these corporate purchasers. Some of them may have needs that they want to fit a green element of their own marketing or their own goals within their company, but most of them are doing it because the price is right. It makes great business sense for them to do it. And they want to take advantage of the incredible price, set price for power that they're able to get. Next slide. So what's next? You can kind of see they anticipate why solar and batteries can be so important to balancing. This is a cool slide because it shows kind of the power consumptive needs during the day. Obviously, in the middle of the night, we don't use that much power. If we ever go to more electric cars, one of the reasons electric cars work so well is that they can end up using power right in the middle of the night when you have excess power and people don't need it. But then during the bulk of the day, solar is going to fill that up because the sun's shining when we need the power. It makes perfect sense. And then as power consumptive needs are still high as you transition into nighttime, you have the storage and the batteries that can carry that through the rest of the evening. That's why you're seeing that development coming along. Next slide. So the one thing that Dorothy and I always sort of brainstorm over too, how do we handle these discussions at the county level? Because we've been doing this for a long time. We go to a lot of these public meetings. We've had tough discussions in counties before, including my own, Ellsworth County. And I'll be the first to say, this was not like out of county people that hated the wind farms against us, locals that wanted the wind farm. Those of us that supported the wind farm were locals that had been there a long time. Those people that did not want the wind farm were also locals that had been there a long time. So there was as much genuine, heartfelt passion on both sides. And I completely respected the people that disagreed with me when we were doing this. And I can only tell you that now, 14 years later, we're maybe not best friends, but we all live in a rural community together. So we bump into each other in the grocery store. We bump into each other at church. It's unavoidable. And like so many other large construction projects, after it's built, things, you have to decide to just kind of move on. And most people moved on, and it's fine. And it's certainly been an enormous benefit to the county and to the people that have those turbines. Next slide. So this is one of the reasons I talk to people about the problem of setbacks. This is Ash Creek Township, where my main farm is. You can kind of see it there in section 17, Free State Farms, that's our home base. They've talked at the state level of putting in setbacks of 3 miles from like pocket parks or poorly designated areas that could be just a 5-acre plot of land that you own that you have a house on. Well, if you have a 3-mile radius, you basically take out the entire township. And that's if you only own 5 or 10 acres in the middle of that township, that's just not fair to the other private landowners who should have the right to do with their property as they wish. There's nothing when they buy that ground that says that some other landowner has an easement on their property for view shed, that it has to look a certain way for the rest of his life because he wants to look out and see it. If you want to protect your view shed, you need to own your view shed. And that's just the way it is. And that's true whether it's a wind farm or anything else. That is private property rights in rural Kansas. Next slide. So I just try to remember some of the things that we learned, and I reiterate, this is a private contract. So we have a piece of ground that is in Smoky Hills Phase 1 that was leased for turbines. It does not have turbines on it, but it's part of the footprint. So we get money every year because we're a part of the project, and we leased early, although we didn't lease that ground. We bought it after it had been leased, but that's how that works. But then we also leased another piece of ground for a wind farm that's not been built yet. We went through that process, and I will tell you, you should always have an attorney look over those agreements. That's just good common sense, whether it's a contract on wind or anything else. If it's a contract, have an attorney look it over. But we've done these privately. They are freely executed. No one conveyed us or forced us to execute those contracts. And it's a private company and a private property owner. Again, the only way to protect your view shed is to own your view shed. If you don't own it, are you suggesting that the county should protect it for you? Is that fair to the other persons that own the view shed that may want to do it, something with it? And then finally, there's more than 40 operating wind farms in the state of Kansas. And we know that there are no damaging reports of health effects. There are no damaging reports of property values. There are going to be several more really interesting presentations through the Climate and Energy Project's webinars in the evenings. And I would encourage you to tune into those. Some of them are going to talk about property values. Some of them are going to talk about health effects, but just anecdotally, and I'm not a doctor, but these are all my neighbors that live up in the wind farm in Ellsworth County. And they've been there for years and they're fine. These are quiet. You barely hear them. Like any construction site, it can have a lot of dust when they're building it, but that's no different than farming. And so they've been really beneficial on the landscape. And certainly in the past 4 or 5 years when the ag economy was so rough, the farmers in our neck of the woods that had wind turbines were set because they were still getting their turbine checks no matter what the grain prices were. And that makes an enormous difference. Property values, everyone's like, well, what's going to happen to property values in our area? If you simply look at what land was selling for in 2006 versus what it's selling now, 15 years later, land prices have probably more than doubled. And there's certainly no difference in Ellsworth County than counties that don't have wind farms. And for example, there is a farm and ranch for sale right in the middle of Smoky Hills Phase 1, and it has 5 turbines on it. They're asking more per acre than any piece of farmland has ever gone for in Ellsworth County before. They haven't sold it yet, but even if they don't get their asking price, it will have sold higher than anything else we've ever sold in the county. So that tells you what it does to property values. It's beneficial because more people in the county have more money to spend to buy more farmland. And then it's your neighbors that are buying that farmland, which always makes me happy because it's not some out of state or out of country investor that's just gobbling it up. Next slide. So that's the end of mine. We can turn it over to questions now, and for both Dorothy and myself.
Well, thank you, Josh. Let's give Josh a virtual round of applause for that great presentation. I always enjoy listening to Josh talk about his experience in Ellsworth and with the wind industry broadly. We're fortunate to have his expertise. So a reminder, if you have some questions, drop them in the chat. We have a few, Josh, that we'll get started with. Brett Ragsdale asked us, what percentage of the time are wind turbines in Kansas being curtailed? And so I don't know if you know the exact percentage, but you might talk about what does it mean to be curtailed for those people in the room that that's a new concept for. And then maybe talk a little bit about why that happens. We had an emailed question that was similar about why are sometimes the wind turbines not turning? Are they being curtailed?
Sure. So this is a great question. My wife, Kimberly, is an expert on this. I'm not as much, but I think between Dorothy and I, we can probably get to some of this. So curtailment happens. The entire grid within our regional transmission organization, which is the Southwest Power Pool, is governed by the Southwest Power Pool down out of Little Rock, Arkansas. And they are making decisions to keep the grid appropriately balanced. And it's kind of fun. I shouldn't say fun. 5 months ago, me giving this talk wouldn't make much sense. But we just had Texas in the great cold polar vortex, Winter Storm Uri, show us what happens when the transmission grid is not balanced. If that transmission grid is not balanced, then it can go out of whack. And if it goes out of whack and drops, you can lose power for months. They did not end up having that happen in Texas, but they came so close that they shut the whole thing down to prevent it from going out of whack so that when they could bring it back on, then it could be brought on appropriately. So these large grid operators, that is their job, to make sure that it functions okay. And that means occasionally they will, if there's too much load on a certain portion of transmission or not enough in another area that is causing trouble on the system, they will curtail power. They can also call for power. So if you are a generating source and maybe it's natural gas peaking plant, they can say, you've got to turn this on right now. I don't care if you're all on vacation and it's Christmas, we have to have the power now. So they are governing what power is coming on and off the system at all times. And so that's why you drive by. Generally, wind farms can function in about like 10-mile-an-hour wind speeds or more, which in Kansas, 10 miles an hour is we call that a still day. So like they can pretty much run all the time. So if you're ever out there and it seems breezy and they're not running, they're probably curtailed, or there may be maintenance being done to them, but they are likely curtailed. I can't tell you the percentage of time that they're curtailed. And if I leave this call and talk to my wife and find out it's a simple answer, I'll be sure to tell Dorothy, but I'm not sure if we know exactly how much all of the different wind farms are curtailed.
Thanks, Josh. You talked a little bit about the Southwest Power Pool and what that is. The Southwest Power Pool has a lot of functions. Balancing power is one of those. They also have a market for power. Do you want to talk a little bit about that market for power before we go on to some other questions?
So that's been one of the cool things about what has happened with wind. When Dorothy and I started with this years ago, it was the assumption was we could put maybe 20% of the grid's power could come from wind energy because it is intermittent. It doesn't blow all the time. So you have to have that balanced with some power that you know is always going to be there. Well, one of the things that nobody ever expected when we got into this was that the Southwest Power Pool would figure out how to do what they call day-ahead pricing. So there's a day-ahead market. And you need, one, a true marketplace where everybody's buying and selling. And then two, incredibly sophisticated meteorological forecasting, which we now have. So they now know the wind is going to blow like this. In North Dakota, it's going to blow like that. In Oklahoma, we're going to get this kind of output, provided everything is running appropriately. Plus, we know that the temperature is going to be 85 degrees, and we're going to need this much power through the Sun Belt in terms of what people are going to be using for their air conditioners. So this is how much power that we're going to need. These are the potential producers. Everybody put your prices in, and then the utilities that sell that power just go on the market and they say, okay, I need this much power, and I'm going to shop for the cheapest price. And you go and you buy the cheapest power. And that's why, back to that map where it's green, wind just beats everybody almost every day, just because it is incredibly cheap, especially since if you balance things out between North Dakota and Louisiana, you may have a still day in Kansas, but there's enough wind up, up and down the system that you're going to be producing power somewhere, and it may be enough to run everything that you need across the entire system.
That's great. Thank you. One more technical question, and then we'll go on to some of the other questions. So Alan asked, have any of the original wind farms in Kansas gone through a rebuild or upgrades? And if so, are the original towers able to be used for the new larger or longer blades?
Yes, and yes. In fact, Smoky Hills Phase 1 and 2 are completing a repower right now. And so if you have been driving by on I-70 and see great big cranes out there again, that's exactly what they're doing. They took the nacelles off, they put new nacelles on, and back to how sophisticated these wind farms are. They had a very engineered system. They now know they've got 12 or 13 years of data on how these turbines produce on an individual turbine by turbine level. So some of them got new gearboxes, some of them got new gearboxes in transmissions and generators. Some of them got new nacelles plus longer blades because they are in the most productive areas, and this could boost their production even more. And so that's what the repower looked like. But it was great for the county. I mean, they came in and even just doing a few minor road upgrades, again, putting in a little more gravel, spent an enormous amount of money on gravel between the two gravel producers in Ellsworth and Lincoln counties, kept them busy all year long. And then the other nice thing, it was an outdoor project that was capable of being done straight through the pandemic. So when our restaurants had to go to all carry out, we still had like 60 or 70 contractors in the area that would come in and get their carry out meals every night. And in a small county, that many meals going out your restaurant door is a huge, huge benefit.
Absolutely. So there's a question that says, I support renewable energy in theory, but sympathize with some of my neighbors who don't want it close to their property. What are the best ways to work through these conflicts?
They're tough. I mean, they're hard. And one thing to keep in mind is that they would be hard whether it's a wind farm or a hog farm or any large construction project. Wind is getting the conversation right now because there's so much wind being built in the state. But really, this is more a conversation about what happens when your rural landscape changes. And it's funny, urban people don't have this issue at all because when you live in an urban area or suburban Johnson County or Sedgwick County, you have the assumption that that's why some people like to put their houses next to a cemetery, because it's the one place that's probably not going to look much different 40 years later. So you stick your house by a park or you stick your house by a cemetery because otherwise stuff's just going to change. Well, those of us that grew up in the country, it's harder for us because we have this assumption that the landscape that we are a part of is always just going to be the same. And that's just not true. And, you know, understanding and respecting property rights, private property rights, is a hard conversation to have, but I've always made it about private property rights because then it's less about saying, well, you just need to accept wind farms because this is what this country has to do. And it's more about your neighbor chose to do this, and they did not arrive at this decision lightly. People don't just sign up for the quick and easy cash and don't give any thought. I mean, these are major generational decisions that these landowners are making, and your neighbor chose to do this, and you have to think in the back of your mind, you know, what made them, you know, you may never know what made them do that, but you have to respect that decision. My wife is from Johnson County. She's not from rural Kansas. And tomorrow, in fact, is our 14th wedding anniversary. And over 14 years, one of the things that I've taught her about rural America is that, at least in my book, you never, ever, ever, ever criticize your neighbor about what they're doing on their property, because you just don't know their story. They may look like the richest person on earth, but they may be hard up. And if they need to build a bigger dairy or push a little harder with their farm operation or wind turbines, you don't know their story. This might be the most exciting thing that's ever happened to them, and to tell them no, and to tell them that what they're doing is changing the landscape too much, at least in my opinion, sort of breaks that cardinal rule of living in rural America.
I appreciate that, Josh. I was at a meeting in Southeast Kansas a couple of years ago, and a gentleman was, you know, there were people who did not want a wind farm down there. And the speaker said, you know, if you're brave enough, stand up and say if you're someone who has signed a lease. And a man stood up and said, you know, I'm so-and-so, you all know me. I've had a dairy in my home and my family for 5 generations. And I got to tell you, that business isn't so good. And if I want to keep it for the next generation, you know, this is what I need to do for my family. And so I think it is those personal stories, and you're exactly right. You don't know what your neighbor's going through. You know, I would say if your county has gone through the process, your planning commission, if you have one, or your county commissioners, you know, I have not seen a county yet who's not doing their due diligence and making sure that they're making decisions based on science and based on real information and experience of wind farms. The next question is, what are some trusted sources on wind energy? And do you have websites you'd recommend that are science-based? And if I have questions after this workshop, who should I ask? Josh, are there particular resources that you like to turn to? And then I'll give a few of the ones we like to use at CEP.
So the hard thing now with the new era of the internet is that, I mean, you can find the truth you want to find. I mean, it's, and if you are trying to find good data to refute someone that's bringing, you know, data that you may not agree with, I hate to break it to you, although I'm guessing whoever asked this probably knows this already too. Your data can be rock solid, and it's probably not going to budge them. CEP is a great clearinghouse in terms of information that can be found on these. But what I would say is, like, there's no data that's as good as on the ground experienced data. And so if someone comes and talks to you about, oh, these things kill birds, we have 40 operating wind farms in the state of Kansas. If you talk to any of the site managers for these wind farms, they are required to do frequent bird kill checks, and they don't find hardly anything. They don't find hardly anything. And those projects, we were out at an Xterra project a couple of weeks ago for a tour, and they're not even near the Hoop and Crane corridor, but they're close enough that they decided to mitigate for that, though they don't even have to. So they have paid individuals that basically follow the Hoop and Cranes as they travel north and south. And if they even get within a day's flight of the wind farm, they will curtail that wind farm DAC just in case. But they simply do not have those problems. Bird strikes came from the early days, that lore of bird strikes came from the early days of Tehachapi Pass down in Southern California, where they were lattice towers and they were smaller turbines. And it was just an entirely different system. And unfortunately now that rages on the internet. But my best data is we have 40 of these operating in the state. Where are the people with the gigantically bad health effects? They're just not there. Do you think that we would, do you think that it would be possible that we would not have heard about those after 14 years by now? It's just not possible.
I would throw in a few sites that we go to regularly to verify information. Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, the National Renewable Energy Lab, the Energy Information Association, our administration, to name a few. But certainly if you have questions after the workshop, Josh's slides and my slides will be available at climateandenergy.org. And if you have questions, you can certainly feel free to email us. I think we have time for one last question. How can I talk to my neighbors and friends about wind energy if they seem unsure? And I think I would start by just recognizing that people have different opinions, and that's okay. Some people are concerned about their view shed, and recognizing that is a good conversation. But make sure that people are, as Josh said, looking to the existing wind farms in Kansas. If there's a lot of interest in going and seeing wind development up close and personal, I'm sure that's something that could be arranged for folks or for a group of people. But really think about your neighbors as the people that they are, and just talk with them about what you know, point them to good resources, and be willing to listen to them. Is there anything else you would add, Josh, to how to talk with your neighbors?
No, I mean, I think that's great. And if you are a landowner that is interested in having a wind farm, and you maybe have leased, and your neighbor approaches you and says, well, I wish that you wouldn't have leased that. I mean, if they're your close neighbors, you guys have to be neighbors for a long time, and I get it. But one response is you can say, well, that's fine. Are you prepared to pay me? Because an average turbine lease is about $10,000 a year. You could say, let's say you were going to get 2 turbines. You could say, are you prepared to pay me $20,000 a year to not have those turbines? And that'd be fine then. I don't have to have those. But if you put it in those terms, a lot of times they'll say, well, now, wait a minute. I'm not going to pay you any money for that view shed. I just want it for free. But yeah, Kansans have always been neighborly, and you don't want to ever see them in a situation where it's not neighborly, but that neighborliness is built on a respect for people's private property rights.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I want to just thank Josh for his insights and thank all of you for joining us this evening. We hope this has been an informative and educational workshop. You'll be able to find a recording of the workshop on our YouTube channel, and the slides will be available at our new website, climateandenergy.org. Don't forget to join us on May 25th, where our guest will be Rondi Triveritas Jack with the Department of Commerce and Joanne Knight, Ford County and Dodge City Economic Development. Ford County is got a lot of wind farms and they're itching for more. So it'll be an interesting conversation where they touch on economic development. Again, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future. Thanks so much.